Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and thank you for joining me today. This is called Consistent Preterism, and it's nice to have you. Today I am going to be taking a look at the phrase, therefore they are without excuse. Okay, and we see that, or so that they are without excuse, therefore they are without excuse, same deal. But we see that in Romans 1. So where we're going to begin is I'm first going to tell you guys a little bit of a story, right? It's not a biblical story. It's just a tale of an everyday family. And this everyday family lived in a city. It was a husband, his wife, and a young child. The child was very young, maybe 3 years old at the time. And they decided to up and move. Okay, so they packed up all their things. They found a new house in a new city. More country setting, a little bit more remote location, and they moved the husband, the wife, and the 3-year-old boy. And so they moved to this house in the country, and the father is excited because he has enough land where he can actually make a garden, okay? And I know what you're thinking. You're like, is he talking about the Garden of Eden? No, I'm not. This is totally unrelated to the Bible narrative in terms of its characters and details. But now this man is excited, so he right away, within a few days of moving in, he gets out there, he's tilling the ground, he's laying out the dimensions of the garden, he's putting up fencing, little fences to keep little rodents out, whatever. But all right, he gets this garden completed, and he goes to work and comes back home, and he finds his 3-year-old boy playing in the garden, right? And so now he obviously he's not going to punish the 3-year-old at that point, because he never told the 3-year-old to not go in the garden, right? He was so busy being caught up in building it that he totally forgot that there were some rules that he had to lay down first. There was some laws that had to be laid down in the land, so to speak. But he never actually verbally told his son that, you can't play in here. This is off limits. Okay, now, the next day, well, back that up a little bit. So he pulls his son out of the garden and he sits him down and he gives him the law of the land. And he says, son, you're not to play in that garden. Okay, you're not to play in the garden. That's a place where I'm going to grow vegetables, and I don't want you to do it. So don't do it. Thou shalt not play in that garden, son. Okay, so the son understands, hears the words of the father, takes heed to those words, and life goes on as usual. A few days go by. The father goes back to work. He comes home, and the son's in the garden playing again. Now the father is clearly upset. And this time is a little different, right? This time the son is without excuse. Okay? He's without excuse. And why is the son without excuse this time? Well, the answer is because the father had already laid down the law for him. The father had told him a few days prior, you're not to go in there. But the son decided that he was going to transgress that law. He was going to violate that commandment that he got from his father, and he was going to do it anyway. He was going to go against his conscience of knowing that his father said he shouldn't go in there, and he was going to do it anyway. And so the father unleashed the wrath on the young boy. Okay? Now, politically correct, you can take that as however you want. He put him in timeout. He took away his fortnight. He beat him over the butt with a belt. Whatever you want. You fill in the blanks. All right? But the point is that this is a story that really explains the Bible narrative to the T, isn't it? It shows that the father gave his law to the son. Okay? But prior to the father giving the law to the son, the father realized that he really didn't have a right to punish him, right? They technically, the son did have an excuse, because the son was unaware as a 3-year-old that he was not supposed to go into that garden. But when the father sat him down and put him on his knee and said, listen, son, you don't go in there, Now, the next time he does it, he's without excuse because he's already been told. Okay, so this is the Bible story. All right, God declares his laws to Israel. He does not declare his laws to anyone other than Israel. Okay, that's all over the Old Testament. All right, it's in Psalm 147, which I'll read to you right now. Verses 19 and 20 says, he declares his word to Jacob, his laws and judgments to Israel. He has not done this with any nation, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Okay, so first of all, he declares his word, his laws, and his judgments to Israel. Okay, that's plain, right? That says what it says. God has given his laws, his judgments, and his word to Israel. The very next verse says, he has not done this with any nation, and as for his judgments, they, the nations, have not known them. In other words, the nations were unaware of God's law, his holy standard, what he required of Israel, and his judgments that were to come along with that law. Because, of course, again, it goes back to you needing a judge, you needing a law in order to have judgments, right? You can't judge someone without a law to rightly judge by. That's the whole purpose and point of the story. So he has not given the law to any other nation, and as for his judgments, the other nations did not know them. Right there, that one passage eliminates all arguments, okay? And it shows you exactly what this story is all about. This story is about a people who had God's laws, had his statutes, had his word, and knew of his judgments, his righteous judgments. And so they were without excuse. And that goes back to that whole thing where sin is not imputed where there is no law. So without a law to transgress, sin is not imputed. Okay? So same thing in Deuteronomy. We see in Deuteronomy where Moses is asking sort of rhetorically in Deuteronomy chapter 4. He says, for what great nation is there that has God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us, for whatever reason we may call upon him? And what great nation is there that has such laws and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day? Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Okay, and then he says, teach them to your children and grandchildren. What is he telling them to teach them? Teach them all the things that your eyes have seen. Teach them the law. Teach them the covenant. Teach them the commandments. Teach them God's judgments. This is a covenant structure, and they were to teach their children and grandchildren. Especially, he says, concerning the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, and the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. Then you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountains burned with fire to the midst of heaven, with darkness, cloud, and thick darkness, and the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. Can you imagine the Lord speaking to the people? You heard the sound of the words, but saw no form. You only heard a voice. So he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, the 10 commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you these laws and judgments, that you might observe them in the land which you cross over to possess. So here is Moses basically telling them, like, listen, simple stuff here. You guys are a great nation, okay? God hasn't done this with any other nation. What other nation has this stuff? Nobody. What other great nation has these laws and judgments? Nobody. Then he says, keep yourself, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen. Well, what did their eyes see? These are Israelites who have come out of Egypt, are they not? They saw plagues. They saw signs and wonders like never before. The Red Sea freaking parted, and they walked through it. And then the Egyptians were swallowed up as they chased them down. They traveled through the wilderness for 40 years with amazing signs and wonders, and a pillar of cloud or smoke or whatever it was leading them through the desert, supplying their every need. Can you imagine? They say 1.5 million or so people traveling through the desert. That's a desert, folks. Okay, we're not talking about a Ponderosa or a Old Country buffet every 5 miles here. We're talking about barren desert, nothing. And these people supposedly survived, 1.5 million of them, for 40 years. Okay, so he's telling them, don't forget what you've seen. Okay, now when he speaks of Israel, he speaks in covenantal onward generation type context. In other words, Israel was going to expand forth for many generations as a covenant people. So, and a lot of times you see these books where they're talking about the sins of the fathers will fall upon, the fifth generation or the third generation, or I will repay into their bosom the works of their fathers and stuff. So it was like generational covenantal type curse where the sins of the fathers would actually pass down to the descendants. Okay, that's all over the Old Testament. But back to what Moses tells him. He's basically telling him, look, all these things you've seen, make sure you don't forget them, and teach them and tell them to your children all the days of your life, especially the time where you stood near the mountain and Moses came down and declared these statutes and laws and judgments to you. Right? He's saying, tell them all these things. Don't forget to tell them all these things, right? Now let's go to Romans chapter 1. Paul says this in verse 18, for the wrath of God. Now, mind you, this is the place where every single solitary pastor will go to talk of all the world. Pagans mainly, because remember, they mostly think that Romans is a Gentile book. It's true Gentiles, true pagans. Even though Romans 4:1, Paul asked them, what did our father Abraham find according to the law? Can you imagine a pagan hearing that their father was Abraham? They would have been like, who? Abraham? No, I ate ham. I'm good. I'm full. No, Abraham, your father. What? All right, it's dumb. So the pastors and preachers would take you to Romans 1 and say this is about all humanity, but it's really not. Because remember the things that I just told you Moses told the Israelites to remember and to tell and to talk of and to do. They were to observe this law that was uniquely and exclusively given to them, the chosen people. And they were to cherish it, and they were to never forget the works that they saw and the things that God did before their very eyes. And look what verse 18 in Romans 1. Paul's writing to these elect sheep in Rome, telling them this. He says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. Okay, interesting. So here we have that whole concept of God showing it to them, yet they're suppressing that truth and they're guilty for it, right? But he continues in verse 20, he says, for since the creation of the world, okay, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Verse 21, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So again, these ones in context are without excuse because they knew God, and even though they knew God and saw these things, right? Okay. He says these attributes being clearly seen, because although they knew God, they didn't glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. Right? So they're ignoring God, they're rejecting God, they're suppressing the truth that they know about God, and so they're without excuse. And because they knew God, they didn't glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, and so their hearts were darkened. So again, it's that whole concept of knowing God, being in covenant relationship with God, having the revelation of the righteous law as his chosen people, special people, high above all peoples of the earth, seeing all these amazing things take place right before your very eyes, and still choosing to reject, and still choosing to turn in unrighteousness and turn away from that God. Okay, he goes on, he says, verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Well, if you remember my teaching from just yesterday on Acts 17, I showed you how Deuteronomy 4 ties into this beautifully. Deuteronomy 4, Moses warns them that they were not to worship idols. They were not to worship the work of men's hands or carved images in the form of a man, a bird, a creeping thing, a reptile. They weren't to do it. They were warned. And here's Paul in Romans 1 saying that professing to be wise, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into images made like man, birds, four-footed animals, and creeping things. And this is all over the Old Testament, right? This is exactly what Moses told them never to do. Right? I mean, let's see. Let me see where I'm at here. Bear with me. I was pretty sure that I had this one pulled up. Oh yeah, here we go. So again, the whole thing about these Israelites, serving gods of wood and stone and being warned not to do it by Moses. Well, we see that that's exactly what this sort of mission of reconciliation is all about in the last days of the New Testament, right? Like, I'll give you some examples. So in Revelation chapter 9, verse 20, we can see how the term mankind is used here. It says, "Now the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues still did not repent of the works of their hands. They did not stop worshiping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk." So there's Revelation, which was about to take place. And Revelation, John is saying that the rest of these men still did not repent of the works of their hands. Right? They did not stop worshiping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, and wood. Well, that's the same thing Moses told the Israelites. For example, in Deuteronomy 28, he said, "The Lord will bring you and the king you appoint to a nation neither you or your fathers have known, and there you will be worshiping other gods, gods of wood and stone." This is always about the Israelites and their transgression of idol worship. Okay, and let's see, Deuteronomy 29:17, "You saw the abominations and idols among them made of wood and stone and silver and gold." Let's see, where else we got here? "So I will cast you out of this land," this is Jeremiah 16, "into a land that neither you nor your fathers have known. There you will serve other gods day and night." Okay, there's that idol worship again. Psalm 115, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of men's hands." Okay, so the point here is that Moses predicts this is going to happen. He warns them that it better not happen. And sure enough, it happens over and over again throughout the history of Israel. And the last days is no different, as Paul is going around basically saying, put away all that stuff, right? God is calling you all to repentance. These times of ignorance he overlooked. But since we are the offspring of God, we ought not think that God is made of gold and silver and such. Okay, for example, look at Acts chapter 19. Let's see. Look at this. He says, "And about that time there arose a great commotion about the way, for a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, 'Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipped.'" Okay, so the point here is that this is the whole thing. Okay, it's all about idol worship. It's all about the Israelites in the latter days fulfilling what Moses said they should not be doing. And that is precisely why this is a message of reconciliation. That is precisely why the message was going out that Christ had nailed their transgressions of the law to the cross. That he had abolished the law in his flesh. He had abolished the handwritten requirements of the law in his flesh. That's exactly what this is. This is transgression and violation of the handwritten requirements of the law. And that was the gospel mission, that they were so far dead and buried in trespasses and sins. They were so far alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, but yet here he was, and he was forgiving them, and the shepherd was bringing the sheep back to the fold. The prodigal son was coming back to the Father. That's the whole point. And those sons of God scattered abroad that Caiaphas said Jesus also died for, those are the prodigal son Israelites, who were still sons of God, just prodigal out in the nations, lost, and they were being brought back. So when we really think about Romans chapter 1, let's go back there, and we hear Paul say that, they've seen these things, they've understood these things, they've witnessed these things, right? God made it known to them. He knew them. Although they knew God, they didn't glorify God. Amos chapter 3 verse 1, "You Israel, of all the families of the earth have I known." In other words, you, Israel, are the only ones that I revealed myself to, the only ones that I gave my law to, my commandments to, my judgments to, the only ones that I covenanted with. So you are without excuse. So you are without excuse. Okay? And as we go on in Romans 1 towards the very end, it says, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. Well, you can't retain God in your knowledge if you never knew of Yahweh to begin with. Folks, ask an Indian living in America, or ask a Chinaman, or ask someone living in Australia back around the time of Christ. Ask them who Yahweh was and see what kind of answer you get. You won't get an answer, okay? Because they didn't have a clue, right? This was a geographical religion. This was a tribal deity. It was their God, okay? And here Paul is saying that even as these certain individuals did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind. So in order to retain God, you must have first had knowledge of God. And that means that these people were tied to and part of the covenant body of Israel. Then he goes on, he says, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, violent, proud, inventors of evil, disobedient, undeserving, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. This is huge, okay? Because Paul is basically showing you who this is, right? The ones in focus here know the righteous judgment of God, right? That's what he just said. He said, even as these ones didn't like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to all these wicked, vile acts. And then he goes on in verse 32, he's speaking of these people who are unloving, unmerciful, unforgiving. And then he goes on and says, who? Those people knowing the righteous judgment of God. These people knew the righteous judgment of God. Well, what did I just read you from Psalm 146? Or Psalms 147, I believe. Hold on, let me go back. Psalm 147, verse 19. He declares his word to Jacob, his laws and judgments to Israel. He has not done this with any nation. And as for his judgments, here it is. As for his judgments, they have not known them. Who didn't know his judgments? The nations. Because remember, he just said he declares his judgments to Israel, his laws as well. He has not done this with any other nation. And as for his judgments, the nations have not known them. Here's Romans. Back to Romans 1, verse 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do all these things, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such thing are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Folks, crystal clear isn't even the word. These ones in Romans 1 who are in context, this world, okay, that was under the wrath of God. In Romans 1, 18 and forward. The people in focus here, in context, are those who knew the righteous judgments of God. And we know from many places, mainly the only one you need to take someone to is Psalm 147. We know that the nations did not know his judgments. Only Israel knew God's judgments. Proving without any shadow of any doubt whatsoever who these ones in context are. And if there's any doubt, that last line also says it. He says, who not only do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. In other words, Paul is making a distinction there between the people in context and another group of people who practice this sort of thing. Right? Because he goes through, he says, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, unforgiving, unmerciful, undiscerning, unloving, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. They not only do those things, but they also approve of those who practice them. So in other words, it's like, hey, you're guilty. You're not only doing those things, but you're also approving of the heathens and the pagans who practice them. Right? They weren't to be unevenly yoked. Okay, so They were approving of another group who practiced such things, and they weren't supposed to do that. Why? Because they were held to a higher standard. They were called. They were without excuse. So that's where I'm going to leave it today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Short and sweet. Not too short, 25 minutes. But again, what I did is I tied Romans 1, the main place in all of Paul's epistles. This is the main place where every single Christian goes to point to their status, to the status of the world today, of the unbelieving world. Yet, when you look at this in context and in light of everything else that this book, this Hebrew Bible lays out, there is absolutely no way that this portion can be speaking about anyone other than Israel. Because it's chock full of statements made by Paul about this people that he's speaking of that can only be speaking of Israel. It's chock full of things that only Israel had. It's chock full of positions that only Israel was in, that being knowing God and knowing of his judgments and having God, the knowledge of God in their mind. Only Israel had that. This cannot be pagans. This cannot be foreigners. This cannot be people on the other side of the globe, because they never knew God, nor did they know his judgments. This was a people who, although they knew God, they chose not to glorify him. They knew the righteous judgment, yet they still did it anyway, and so they were without excuse. Folks, that's all I got. If you liked it, give it a like-a-rooski. If you didn't, take a hike-a-rooski. Remember, be kind in the comments, and we'll catch you on that flippity-floppity, peanut buttery flop side.